Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. Friends, it's good to be with you again today. Welcome back to the Democracy Den studio, or whatever we want to call it today. Very excited to have a friend with me, a colleague, hopefully a name that you recognize, our intrepid local reporter, Paul Monies. Hello, Paul. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Have you been on our podcast before?
I actually haven't, and I'm kind of surprised.
You should
this
be
is my
offended.
first time, you know.
Very sorry about
It's
that.
okay. No, I mean,
It's a major
happy
oversight.
to help, but yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, thanks. Paul, you and I have known each other for a few years through the world of local politics. We also live just a few blocks apart.
I know. You moved to my neighborhood about a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, something
just
like
a year
that.
ago.
Yeah, so yeah, not too far away, but fellow Gatewood resident.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that we both took the time to drive down here just so we can have a conversation.
Right. We could have had it in your front yard or whatever.
That's right.
But, you know.
Next time we'll do garage beers, and it'll be, we won't record that conversation. Much more cordial, and probably should not be on the microphones. Well, Paul, one of the things we're going to talk about today, we mentioned briefly last week in our episode, but I'm really grateful that you came on to talk a little more in depth. As campaign season is gearing up for 2026. You had an article a couple of weeks ago about candidate campaign debt, essentially, right?
Right, yeah.
And this is about candidates who like loan themselves or loan their campaign money so they can, well, either get going or, I don't know, win, I guess is what they're trying to do. Kind of walk us through it. What was the top line? What made you interested in this, and what did you find?
Well, you know, it was that time of year when you start seeing campaigns, at least statewide campaigns, and start kind of going up and setting up campaigns and spending money. And so we wanted to take a look beyond kind of the normal, like who's ahead, who's behind on fundraising. We kind of looked at, how much these candidates self-funding. Now, there's obviously people probably know there's two ways to fund your campaign. You can, as a candidate, you can give yourself unlimited money in donations.
There's no limit to that?
No limit for a person, for the candidate themselves. Now, there are limits on other people. There's PAC limits, political action committees are limited. Individuals and spouses are limited to a certain point, much like the federal system, so we kind of mirror that a little bit in Oklahoma. But, there are quite a lot of candidates who seed their campaign or feel it needs to get started with a personal loan. Now, technically, you can have a bank go out and back a loan for you, but for the most part, that is a really risky exercise for a commercial bank or any kind of bank. So they typically don't do that, but you can actually do that if you have a friendly banker. But most of the time, it's done in the form of filing it. You actually have to move the money from your personal account to the campaign account. You can't just put it on paper. And so we kind of took a look at that, and it was prompted a little bit by some of the press releases that had gone out previously in the spring. Charles McCall, the former Speaker of the House, is running for governor now. He is a fairly wealthy banker from Atoka. He had put a press release out in the spring that I kind of filed away, and he said, to show my donors, I'm matching donors' funding with my own personal loans. And so he had said that in the spring. That kind of put the seed in my head. Yeah. Let's take a look at this. And of course, we had heard, obviously, in the years past, Governor Stitt, when he first ran in 2018, was a political unknown, had zero name ID, but also had founded a mortgage company and was fairly wealthy by all extent. And so he had lent his money to his campaign the first time, and continue to do it when he ran for re-election in 2022. So I wanted to kind of take a look at how this works and kind of what I could find out just from the filings, and that's kind of just where we started.
Yeah, how interesting. First of all, I didn't know you could get like a signature loan for your campaign. That would be risky because like you're basically counting on your ability to raise money to pay that loan back.
Right.
Otherwise, you're on the hook personally.
Right, yeah.
And the bank is like trying to assess you, like, do I think you're going to be able to raise money? First of all, you're coming to me in the first place. This is not a vote of confidence.
Right. Yeah. You don't have a whole bunch of donors lined up yet. I mean, and a lot of that is, that does come with time. But the interesting thing about the candidate loans is that you can pay them back later with donors that do actually fund your campaign. So, if you have the money up front and you're wealthy enough to afford that kind of thing, it's probably a pretty good deal if you can chip away at it in years after that. Now we have seen, in fact, one of the examples we saw was another candidate for governor, Attorney General Kentner Drummond, first ran in 2018 for AG and lost in a runoff, but he had loaned his campaign quite a bit of money. Mm-hmm. He's carried that campaign debt on. So he's had an AG campaign in 2018 that he then started an AG campaign in 2022. And then he has just now this year formed his own governor committee. These are all state committees. State law allows you to roll over campaign debts and funds from one office to the other in a state. You can go from a legislature to a statewide office or back and forth, but you are allowed to do that. So we saw Gentner Drummond pull that debt forward, and he's, I think, pulled about $2 million forward is now a debt on his governor's campaign. But he's also spending a lot of money and raised a lot of money on that front, too, from other donors.
How interesting. Who is that debt owed to then?
So technically it is owed to the candidate themselves, the person.
Okay.
Now, it is on the books of the campaign committee.
Right. Okay.
But I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's the same entity, even though legally there is a distinction there. Right. There is supposed to be some kind of, veil there that is between that. And everyone knows, I mean, you don't have to lend your money. If you have the money up front, you can just give yourself money and not expect to be paid back. And so some candidates do that.
Right.
And it's just probably a little easier to keep track of maybe, but.
So like when they say they're going to write off the debt, it's really just like, I'm not going to pay myself back.
Basically,
right.
Yeah.
So if I gave my campaign $10,000 and I spent, and I raised 10, so it's 20 altogether, and then if I spent all 20, I still kind of owe myself those 10,000 to pay back. So you're hoping to raise that money as well. And if you haven't done it yet, you can just say, well, I'll just pay myself back later.
Right. And we have seen that with Governor Stitt. He folded up his 2022 campaign account, I think last year, maybe last summer. He still had debt on there. He just wrote it off.
Right. I guess it's kind of a bad look, especially if you're a wealthy individual, to be like, well, I'm raising money today to pay myself that money for what I loaned it earlier. Like donors aren't eager to give when they know you've got deep pockets already.
Well, and that's another thing too, is we took a little bit in the story looking at the differences between state law on candidate campaign loans and federal law. So for a while there, going back to I think 2002, there was a limit on how much you could pay back a loan after a campaign, say between an election day and you start office or whatever. The feds had a $250,000 limit on raising money after the fact to pay off a campaign debt. And so there was real kind of issues around that the Congress had decided, 20-something years ago that was an issue. Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, U.S. Senator Ted Cruz out of Texas basically fashioned himself a test case and had already won re-election. He's had a fairly competitive last couple of cycles to running for the Senate, but knew directly what he was doing after he won re-election last time. He loaned himself some money. I think it was maybe $300,000, and then took his campaign to court or something like that. It took the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, to court over that debt because he said, well, I can only get $250,000 and I put $300,000 of a loan in here.
Right.
And it went through an appeals court, a district court, and went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is all kind of secondary stuff to the Citizens United decision in 2010 that opened the floodgates on a lot of this campaign spending. But he was like, look, if money is speech, why are you limiting my speech after the fact? And the Supreme Court in its current configuration agreed with that. And so now there are no limits on federal campaigns on paying yourself back from loans from future donations.
Right. So if you're someone like President Trump, who pretty famously ran up a pretty substantial campaign debt, at least in his first term, right? Like millions and millions of dollars, then he could raise money to pay himself back if he wants to. Yeah,
and actually it's interesting. We looked at some other states. There's only 10 states have some kind of limits like that on paying back candidate loans. Interestingly enough, they're not just all, liberal states. California is one of them, obviously. Texas is one of them too.
Right.
So, which is kind of surprising because you kind of think Texas has just got that. Texas state law has no donation limits on anybody.
Right.
You can just give whatever you want.
Right.
But they do have, strangely on the books still in Texas, a limit on how much you can raise to pay off a candidate loan.
I think that's even more interesting for large states like Texas and California, where it's just going to cost more money to run statewide. I mean, the cost of a U.S. Senate campaign or a gubernatorial campaign in Texas is several multiples bigger than it would be here in Oklahoma.
Of course.
And so you're going to need more money. So you might have to, like, if you're really wealthy, you might have to loan yourself more money. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and you look at the size, obviously, I mean, campaigns, like, you're looking at media markets.
Right.
Oklahoma, obviously the two biggest are Tulsa and Oklahoma City, but we also kind of have Ardmore kind of that bleeds into North Texas. On the eastern side, we've got kind of Fort Smith kind of part that bleeds into Oklahoma. So, there's several media markets you have to be active in if you're running a statewide campaign in Oklahoma. But Texas, there's probably, I'd guess, maybe 15 to 20 different media markets that you have to spend money in and talk to local stations and all that kind of stuff and get your campaign run that way.
Yeah. And just like more stations in those markets as well, right?
Right. Yeah. They all have 2 or 3 affiliates of whatever network they're just out there.
How interesting. So let's talk about Oklahoma state, like legislative races in particular, because this is some of the ones you looked at. I think kind of the one example you highlighted in your piece is about Representative Jim Shaw, who's from Chandler, and he was a freshman, right? He knocked out the appropriations chair, Kevin Wallace.
Kevin Wallace,
right?
That's right, yeah.
So he was taking aim at leadership,
right?
And Wallace was coming in with a hefty campaign chest of $700,000 or something, and he was able to fund. That was from previous campaigns, right? He'd been raising
rolled
money.
it over, from previous House races,
And he was about to term out too. I think he had one term left.
One left, yeah. So he was almost term limited, and so that was obviously a big surprise last year during the primaries. To come from little no name ID in a very powerful district of someone that was in leadership ranks in the House Republican caucus, ran or chaired the Appropriations and Budget Committee, which is a hugely powerful position in the legislature, and of course had been running for 5 previous cycles, and so already had relationships with donors, already had relationships with political action committees and folks who kind of are supportive. And so, Jim Shaw, brand new lawmaker, had never run for office before. That he told me. I mean, this was his first run, and he said that he didn't really expect to. He loaned himself a total of probably more than $350,000 for that campaign. He also just gave himself some money. He said, I seeded my campaign, I think, starting out with $20,000 just to show, just not even a loan, just straight up cash to my campaign to show my donors that I've got some skin in the game. But he ran kind of a very grassroots campaign and is still kind of plugged into the grassroots side of things. I think there was 4 people in the primary, and then he obviously made it to the runoff with Kevin Wallace and won in the primary runoff last August. And so, that was by far the largest, highest spending legislative campaign that we've seen in Oklahoma history so far.
That's well, and he didn't have a Democratic or independent or libertarian challenger in the general. So this, we talk a lot about open primaries here, and like this was a race that was decided essentially in a closed primary. Only Republican voters had a chance to vote. But that's a lot of money. I mean, I think most typically that meant that the total race, right, was like over $1 million.
$1.1 million from the candidates themselves, and then there was quite a bit of independent expenditure money, which obviously is not coordinated with any campaign, but anyone can spend to any limit for independent expenditures, and so a lot of that was spent supporting Wallace by independent expenditures. So there's another 310, maybe 315,000 independent expenditures that I could find tied to that race as the primary runoff too.
Right. Wow. That's a huge amount more than, I think a typical House race is going to cost like $80,000.
If that much, yeah. I mean, and like you said, if they're not competitive in terms of a general or whatever, obviously Republican primary is kind of where the action is for a lot of these districts. But I've talked to another candidate who said, look, I knew going in it would maybe cost 70, 80, 100,000, and for it to go up to more than $1 million for a House race. And in fact, in that Jim Shaw, Kevin Wallace primary, I think maybe I looked at the vote totals, maybe 8,000 people total voted in the runoff.
So the cost per vote is like way up.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, it's probably almost the hundreds, I'm sure, for that. So, definitely. I mean, but I think, interviewed you for this story too, and so thanks for your comments. But you said that none of this stuff ever goes down. Every race is the most
Always
expensive
most
ever.
expensive, yeah.
So we're not going to see any of this going down unless there's any kind of real change that we're limiting any kind of donations or on the independent expenditure side too.
Yeah. Have you done any analysis, and it's okay if you haven't, because I haven't either, but on the, if, I don't know, an individual's net worth yields a higher likelihood that they're going to win election. Like we kind of know in horse race politics, right, that we watch campaign fundraising numbers as a proxy for support, right? If someone's able to, and this is, I think, more useful in races like for the presidency, where they're generally on equal footing. They're probably both wealthy with huge networks and they've got nationwide support. And so it's really a matter of like, I don't know, it's like the Cold War, right? Like how many nuclear bombs do you have and how many does they have? And so, but at the state level, like it's a little bit different stakes, right? Like, and so, but as an example, if Shaw is able, or any candidate like him is able to self-fund an unlimited amount. So if, I don't know, if you and I are running, we live in the same neighborhood, I don't know your net worth, but I imagine it's similar to mine, right? But if we're running against someone who lives in Nichols Hills or Gallardi or someone who's like a multimillionaire and they can self-fund, well, from the jump, we're at a huge disadvantage. Do you know if that correlates with outcomes at all?
I don't know, just because to do that kind of analysis, you'd have to have a lot of factors go into each kind of race.
Yeah.
You could maybe compare it on a statewide basis, but as you know, with term limits and turnover in the House and Senate, even you've got lawmakers now that are not waiting to go to their full term limits. You've got ones that are going halfway and quitting, and so you've got some more natural turnover because of that. So it would be. And of course, the districts will be changing whenever you have a new census coming around. So you have maybe some gerrymandering or some moving around of voters. So that would be great to be able to know that for sure. Now we can all kind of guess. I think we've all seen the power of obviously deep-pocketed candidates, but I think another part that goes into this, and this wasn't necessarily the focus of my story, but there's a lot of small donors too, especially on the national races. You've kind of gone to that mode of like millions of small donors who are giving almost on a subscription basis, $50 a month, $10 a month.
Right.
And you can get a lot of money that way too, rather than just having, huge corporations fund whatever political action committee they can and do. So there's that type of it as well. But, it doesn't always translate into winning either. I interviewed a candidate who ran up in the Tulsa area, Kane Smith. He was in a 4-person primary runoff or primary last year and did not make it to even a runoff. He came in third, but he lent himself $400,000 for a House race up there. And he, I interviewed him. He was, pretty easygoing. He sounded like he had some investment money that he had and has obviously been a successful business person. So it didn't really faze him that much. He kind of said, well, this wasn't exactly the amount I wanted to spend, but here we are. I did it. He said pretty point blank, he said, this is kind of proof that money doesn't always buy you an election. He's like, I had a realistic campaign manager that said I should be spending on this and this and this, and he did it, and still ended up coming in third in a 4-person primary.
Yeah. This is fascinating. I do know candidate work really. My sister ran for her local city council in Hera earlier this year. So I was like a little involved in that because it's my sister. And so she started off and she was like, I'm just going to start with like $200. I was like, great. And then we like did some fundraising and raised like $2,000, which was enough to buy some yard signs and a few t-shirts and like print literature and stuff for her some mail, normal things you would do. And she was not successful. And so just like on the numbers, I was like, man, I could stomach losing $200 on a city council race. And then I also feel like I'm going to let down to everyone who donated. Maybe this is why I don't run for office. I want to please people. But thinking about how much bigger, I can't imagine having this conversation with my wife about like, hey, listen, I think we should give $400,000.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, I made this comment to my coworkers. I'm like, look, that when you're spending $400,000 on a race and that's like buying a house.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And for most people, that is a large investment. That's the biggest one they'll probably ever make.
That they'll pay for 30 years.
Right. Yeah. And so, and so that kind of goes back to like, this is not your typical run-of-the-mill candidate that does this. I mean,
Right.
there's a range of incomes in the House and Senate. Obviously, there's wealthier people. There's people you don't think are wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any idea at the Oklahoma level what a candidate's actual income is.
Right.
We do not have the older tradition for federal candidates was if you're a presidential candidate, you release your taxes. Of course,
Sure.
Donald Trump stopped kind of doing that tradition in 2016 and never really fully did that at all. And even we've tried as reporters to ask gubernatorial candidates to release their tax returns.
Yeah.
I think last time around not last time, but the time before, we'd asked Drew Edmondson, and he did.
Yeah.
But he'd been in public life for quite a while, and and we asked Stitt's campaign, and when he ran in 2018, he said no. I mean, I think maybe they were taking a page out of Donald Trump's playbook on that side, because I mean, all we have in Oklahoma is what's called the Personal Financial Disclosure Report, which doesn't have any numbers.
It's like a one-page
right.
checkbox. Yeah.
It's a checkbox, and it's like if you have an interest, I think maybe more than $5,000 in income from some entity,
Yeah.
you have to put it on there.
Yeah.
So a lot of them, it's just obviously their job.
Right.
But some people have, LLCs and property interests or companies they put on there.
Yeah.
So we see that, and then that's, probably pretty good in terms of transparency. Well, this guy's running a oil and gas company, and, he does maybe take the constitutional privilege on votes that would directly affect his company that were oil and gas related. And you do see that sometimes from time to time at the legislature, but we don't have any idea how much money they're actually making.
Right.
So,
right.
But the proxy is, if you're self-funding or self-loaning,
Yeah.
you know that's probably a pretty good idea that you're willing to put that much money into the campaign and kind of be okay with not getting it back at some point.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and even just thinking about some of the candidates who are running for governor right now, right? You mentioned former Speaker Charles McCall, A.G. Drummond, I think Mike Mazzei. I guess he's still in the race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's there. Yeah, he was former state senator and worked in state administration for a couple of times, and still out there. And if you want to run down, Mike Mazzei loaned himself. He's a financial professional,
right?
Investment advisor. Used to do the budget negotiations for Stitt in his first term, I think.
Yeah.
And he loaned himself $250,000 for his statewide gubernatorial bid. I think Charles McCall has loaned himself a total of $1.6 million so far for his bid, and then Gittner Drummond has raised a lot of money, and I didn't see a ton of loans this time, but he pulled up the debt from previous AG races that are still on his gubernatorial disclosure filings for campaign stuff.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And then on the other side, you've got Cindy Munson,
right.
And I don't know. I know what kind of car she drives, and it's not the same car that Speaker McCall drives.
No.
I've seen his fancy truck, and so she has obviously campaign accounts from previous House races and stuff, but it'll be interesting to kind of see what this dynamic is now. She, at least as far as I've seen, does not have a Democratic primary challenger, at least not yet.
Not yet, right?
But we know on the Republican side, there's going to be a crowded primary, which will likely mean a runoff.
Right.
So they've got essentially more elections to pay for. So there may be more costs, but that could be a really interesting, just dynamic there on what the difference is between the candidates and how much they're able to raise.
Yeah, and I think we saw that definitely with Cindy Munson's first gubernatorial report on spending at the end of July. Surprisingly kind of strong for this early in a race for a Democrat. They're not usually known for raising a ton of money. Now, once they get to the actual general, that's a different story. But she seemed to have a decent chunk of smaller donors, like I was saying earlier,
right.
Kind of a broader base of kind of, what we would typically call regular folks rather than kind of, big kind of PACs or the, big contributors that are always on the campaign finance reports that we kind of hear about.
Yeah. Do you happen to remember what the total cost of either 2022 or 2018 gubernatorial races were? I'm trying. I feel like, and if this includes outside spending, like the IEs, because I feel like Hoffmeister's campaign spent like around 50 million or something, but that might have been including IEs.
I think if you include the IEs, for sure. I mean, I've been kind of delving into campaign data for a couple of decades now in Oklahoma, especially, and I used to kind of be surprised when a gubernatorial campaign would spend $5 million, for the campaign, for the whole cycle, or either a primary and a runoff or a general. And now that doesn't seem like it would get you anywhere. I mean, that's basically a good start these days.
Right.
So I think I want to say we're with the independent expenditures, which were by far, I think the last cycle in 2022, and I may be telling a couple of fibs, but I think the IEs combined were more than all the races themselves.
Yeah.
Which would make some sense because there was so much kind of what you call dark money.
Right.
You saw those ads that were not connected to a campaign at all.
Right.
And so it was obviously a big issue for Governor Stitt. After he won re-election, he had a task force that he was like, hey, I want to do two things. I want to look at the security of our election system, which in Oklahoma is pretty top-notch. Also look at recommendations to do some reforms on possibly independent expenditures. Now, the report that came back was basically no limits for anybody.
Right. Let's do it. Let's do what Texas is
right.
doing.
Yeah. So that was maybe a little surprising, but maybe not given the atmosphere that we've kind of seen post Citizens United and kind of the campaign needs and wants and kind of the huge amount that you're spending on politics these days.
Yeah. You mentioned Citizens United, and that's a good reminder. I was going to tell you and listeners, I guess you're the real audience here, but there's a podcast called How to Fix It. No affiliation with us, but John Avlon is the host. He's a former CNN, I think, reporter. He's got a good TV reporter voice, but it's looking at problems in our democracy and how to fix it. And his most recent episode, I think from this week, it's about Citizens United, and it says Citizens United almost broke democracy. Here's the fix. And he interviews my friend Jeff Clements, who runs an organization called American Promise, and they have a really, I think, interesting and unique approach to trying to overturn Citizens United by passing a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. They've been working kind of state by state on that. Anyway, it's a good interview. Jeff is great about sharing information, and I remember I was in the McDonald's drive-thru the other morning listening to it, and like stared at my stereo with wide eyes at like the sheer volume of money that is going. Like we all know, money in politics is a lot and gross. In fact, the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Pew Research, they do the big annual survey asking Americans what their biggest concerns are, and the corruptive influence of money in politics was number 3 a few years ago. It is now number 1 after the last election, higher than literally everything else, higher than crime, higher than healthcare costs, higher than immigration. Like when Americans recognize that like there's too much money in politics, it seems like lawmakers might respond by doing something.
Well, and I think you're right, because we have seen a little inkling of that in Oklahoma. In fact, you were the one that kind of told me about this, but back in the spring in the legislative session, there was a resolution. The House Majority Floor Leader, Josh West, basically had a resolution just like you were saying about the push to maybe get a constitutional amendment at the national level to kind of bring some power back to the states to regulate these kind of campaign finance issues, post Citizens United. And so he got 7 co-sponsors, all Republican, to sign on to that. Now I think as a resolution, it's non-binding. So they just basically say, hey, are we okay with this? And they say yes, and then send it on to Senate. And I don't think it actually went anywhere in the Senate. But, it's a good kind of reminder that, before maybe immediately after the years of Citizens United, a lot of the gnashing of teeth was done by Democrats who felt like they couldn't keep up. Now it's not, I wouldn't say flipped, because I think it's both parties now realizing that there's a lot of money in politics and it's almost too much. So you're seeing, especially like the last cycle with Governor Stitt's re-election, this idea like, who's all these independent expenditures coming from?
Right.
Are they coming from a foreign government even?
Right.
Are they coming from out of state? Or someone that's, they did say in this resolution that the House passed that it kind of drowns out regular voices from their constituents even. Because, they're not hearing from regular folks because they're just getting all this, at least voters are hearing from all these other parties that want to shape the issue a certain way. And, of course, that's not illegal. But, we're kind of seeing a flip of kind of the concern is kind of more broadly across the parties, too, where you would have had normally like typically a Republican in power would want to stay in power and raise money from the same people who put him there. You're seeing, well, somebody just may be really mad at you and have a lot of money and can fund a huge independent expenditure campaign against you, then you don't even know who it is.
Right. Well, that's, people like Elon Musk, right? That's like everyone knows who Elon Musk is these days, but he...
250 million, I think?
I mean, how do you compete with that? Like, that's an unreasonable amount of money that any one person... I don't think I'm alone in saying that's too much money that any one person should
spend. And I
think
there's only so much, even on our, with the cable and streaming and all that kind of stuff, there's only so much airwaves and airtime that we have. You risk having every single commercial be a campaign commercial, which we've seen that before. It's obviously like that in other states sometimes. We've seen it a little bit in Oklahoma too. I would say probably the only people super excited about money in politics are possibly TV stations during election cycles. But, that's a pretty cynical take because obviously they're very invested in covering races as well outside of the advertising side. So you can't bash them too much, but that is a lot. And they have to offer the same rate to every candidate. So they're not like raising the rates up and saying, well, you're a rich governor, and so you have to pay more. They have to, federal regulations make them basically offer the same rate card.
It is tough, though. I mean, well, it's like the old adage, right? That in a gold rush, you want to be the guy selling shovels, right? And that's what they're just like, listen, we're just here. We've got airwaves. If you want it, you can pay for it. As someone who runs a political podcast, I'm sometimes disappointed that it's connected to my 501c3. Otherwise, I'd be like, great, let's open up commercials. Maybe we can self-support. But that would be both unethical and arguably illegal, or at least run afoul of the IRS. Great. Well, Paul, do you have a few more minutes to stick around?
Sure.
I was going to pivot to another story also involving money. But first, I just want to take a break. I've just been getting a bunch of text messages, and I feel compelled as an American to wish Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce happy nuptials. I just saw a little while ago they got engaged, and now the deluge of memes is coming into my phone.
Yeah, I saw that over lunch, and I was like, wow. I'm kind of curious now because my daughter is age 10 and is a huge Taylor Swift fan. She does not have a cell phone, thankfully, yet. Cell phones are obviously banned in school during the instructional periods. So I'm kind of curious how this word got out at school today. I'll have to ask her when she gets back tonight or this afternoon and see how she first heard about it. Did a teacher tell her? Did someone after school or after school club tell her? So it's interesting in these days of kind of instant news and, there is sometimes some bubbles that maybe not getting it immediately like they would normally in the past. So, is there a middle schooler that has a phone and is not supposed to be checking it and telling you like that, so.
Yeah, that's right. Someone's in the bathroom checking. That's funny. That reminds me, now we're way off topic. We'll come back. But I remember in 8th or 9th grade, I think it was 9th grade, being in the cafeteria during lunch. It was the day that the OJ verdict was coming back in for OJ Simpson. I'm sure there are at least a few of our listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about. But a buddy of mine had snuck in his Walkman, right? Like with a...
it was a radio part?
Like radio thing. And it had little earbuds before they were called whatever Apple has, but just black, Walmart brand earbuds. And he had it down his sleeve because it was wired. And he was just had his hand up to his ear like he was resting his hand listening. And we're all like eating lunch and we're waiting and the jury's coming back in. And there was one teacher he had been a substitute for a long time. And there's not a lot of male teachers and he was pretty cool. And so he kind of knew us and he came up and stood next to our table and we were like, hey, man, how's it going? And he said, what's happening? Are they back in the courtroom yet? And we were like, yeah, they just walked in. And so he he wanted us to keep him in the loop. So he just kind of stood by our table. And I remember my buddy repeating the verdict, the votes as they came in of not guilty, not guilty. And it was so exciting. Not that this had any bearing on my life, but it was we're breaking news right here in the lunchroom. And
and everyone was talking about it, I'm sure. It's huge news, So, and in fact, I don't remember the verdict coming in, but I do remember I was delivering pizzas that summer before when he went on the Bronco race. And I distinctly remember delivering a pizza to a house in Jacksonville, Texas, and they had that Bronco chase on the TV. And I gave them the pizza. They paid me the money. I could see on the background they had the OJ chase on TV at that time. So
that's funny.
It's kind of wild. That was obviously was out and about and delivering pizzas, so not connected to the news, and all I listened to was CDs on my car stereo, so I wasn't plugged into the radio. And so it was just like, it was funny to kind of remember that part too, and even before the verdict, when they were chasing them down. So.
How funny. What a time to be alive.
I know.
Well, this is much probably better for America than the OJ situation, but anyway, my wife texted me and said, well, there's no sense posting anything else on the internet today because that's going to suck up all the news for the next 24 hours.
If you're a government agency, shove out some bad news
That's right
now.
Yeah, time for take the trash out. That's exactly right. Well, and our listeners won't hear this episode until a few days pass. It'll be old news by the time they hear it. Great. Yeah. Well, thanks for being here with us, folks. Paul, back to money and politics. You had another story just last week about our state treasurer making an attempt to change corporate policies. And this has to deal with TSET, right? The Oklahoma Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust.
That's right. Yep.
And our state treasurer, Todd Russ. Unpack this for us. Tell us kind of what's happening.
Yeah, we've been kind of following this effort for a little bit now. But the latest part was, TSET is a $2 billion endowment trust that is done for the benefit of the state. It was set up by the voters on then Attorney General's kind of Drew Edmondson's kind of request when the multi-state tobacco settlements were coming out. Now, some states just took the money and spent it right away. We had the idea in Oklahoma to start TSET, essentially endow a trust that has investment earnings that you then spend on health projects and grants and stuff like that. So they've been pretty successful throughout the years, giving out probably in the neighborhood of probably hundreds of millions of dollars over the last couple of decades from this investment thing. But interestingly enough, TSET has its own board of directors that kind of decides where the grants go and how they do that, and that's got its own separate kind of constitution and makeup. But separately from that, the people running the investment side for TSET is made up of the state treasurer as a chairman of what's called the board of investors for TSET, which is a completely separate group than their other regular board of directors. And there's only 5 people on this board. Todd Russ is a chairman. His office kind of runs the administrative side of that. They meet usually every month, maybe every couple months, depending on their schedule. But their main job is to interview investment managers and make sure that the fund returns are being invested wisely and for the benefit of the state. And so they have obviously a lot of money to kind of, much like a pension fund, a lot of money to dispose of. They own quite a bit of, index funds that are tied to that. Now, the interesting thing about them is that they are not allowed to own any tobacco-related stocks. That is kind of the one kind of thing they're not allowed to do. So they have to almost have a boutique set of stocks to kind of track,
right?
Because you wouldn't have someone like Philip Morris, which is obviously has tobacco and nicotine interests and stuff like that. You don't want them in your index fund,
right? And
so you kind of have to have fund managers work with you and kind of do it a little bit. But Todd Russ in the last year or so has kind of had some help from outside groups and conservative legal groups and conservative kind of shareholder accountability groups that have kind of convinced him to kind of use TSET and get on what's called a shareholder resolution. So the short version of this is that we've now, the board voted last week to target 10 retail companies that we kind of all heard of, big brand names, Chipotle, Starbucks, Amazon, Estee Lauder, the cosmetics company. Boeing is one of them too, to kind of asked the companies to kind of do reports on what Todd Russ and his allies kind of say would be back to neutral. He thinks that some of these corporate boardroom policies have gone too far into what they are calling the woke territory, with diversity and equity and inclusion policies, with environmental, social, and governance policies, all the kind of 3-letter acronym boogeyman words that are out there. And I think the pendulum has swung too far into that, away from the actual benefit of the shareholders, which is an argument you can make for sure. And it's not unheard of that you have pension funds kind of be activists, investors, and you've seen it more recently in the last couple of decades on oil and gas and energy side of things. You've kind of gotten up. Exxon has had shareholder resolutions that have passed that have kind of limited some of their options, they think. But this is all corporate kind of democracy kind of thing. If you own a share of a company, you are a shareholder and you have a vote.
Sure.
Now, Todd Russ and his friends would say, well, these proxy votes kind of happen on autopilot. Nobody looks at them, and everyone kind of votes the same way as their investment advisor. So the fund will maybe own 60% of a company. They have 60% of their votes on the shareholder resolution. And, some of them are very benign stuff. Some of them ask for, a little more transparency on corporate payouts and stuff like that, and pay packages for CEOs. But they're across the board on all kinds of things. And, of course, they're voted on every year by the shareholders of that company. And so we've now targeted 10 of them that TSET owns as part of its investment portfolio, and basically asked them to kind of do reports at the behest of TSET to kind of maybe get away from some of their so-called woke policies on corporate kind of stuff. So we've kind of seen this happen. This is not the first time. They did it last year. And in fact, they targeted 5 companies last year, more than that actually at the beginning. But none of the efforts that TSET had sponsored last year got more than 1% of the votes at any of the shareholder meetings that they were at. And so, we kind of think, well, why are we doing it again? But it's just another way to kind of have some of these groups continue their conversation about what they think are too far boardroom policies that are in a particular direction way beyond what they would say would be typical for an Oklahoma voter or even an investor in TSET.
Yeah. That's really, and this is like way in the weeds, but I find this interesting. Like I've got my retirement account, and every so often I get a notice in the mail about an upcoming shareholder meeting, and I can cast my ballot if I go online. And usually you're voting for like a new board of directors,
right?
None of whom I know who they are.
CPA firm, it's really standard stuff,
right?
Yeah.
And so usually I'm like, well, I don't know, and that's why most investors like me just trust whoever is managing things to do it, or you just because if you don't, you can vote, and if you don't, then it basically goes with the majority or whatever.
Right.
And every now and then I'm like, I'm going to read into this when I start, and then I immediately regret it. I'm just like, I wish that I owned, tens of thousands of shares more so I could actually have a voice in this. Now, of course, I'm also someone who will argue that every vote counts. And so sometimes I do cast a vote for whoever I think based on their little bios might seem like, oh, they seem good. Okay.
Right.
And then I feel a little bit better about myself for being like, I did something.
Research, yeah. You found out issues and what was going on, yeah.
Yeah, learning your ballot.
Right.
Did it make a difference? Not necessarily. Was it worth doing? Arguably, on some level. And this is not uncommon. Like what TSET's doing is not uncommon in terms of like big research or big investment funds, right? Like will often lean on a company or try to exert their will in some way, especially if they own not even a majority, but just a substantial number of shares. Is this new or unusual for essentially like a government or quasi-government entity to be this kind of involved? Do you know of any other examples?
As far as the state treasurer in this type of endowment fund, I think this may be the first example that we've kind of seen an elected state treasurer kind of go down this path. You've seen in the past various pension funds for big state employee pensions, like, say Illinois, California, New York. They have kind of pushed companies in certain directions that, arguably could be maybe too much or not maybe against the idea of that company making a good return for their shareholders. But, those are all things that come out. But as far as getting this much outside advice, we've got there's a whole network of kind of conservative legal groups and conservative kind of activist shareholder groups that are agitating for this change. And they're using the same language that the other side had used over environmental policies for a number of years and was somewhat successful at a lot of companies. And so they're kind of using that same playbook, but we haven't seen this level of involvement from a state treasurer that's elected and basically becoming the self-appointed hall monitor for these retail stocks, which operate in way more places than just Oklahoma. And so, there's one of the resolutions that they passed is basically asking the drug distributor McKesson huge, one of the biggest ones in the country, to stop distributing the abortion pill, mifepristone, if I'm saying that correctly, which is one of the two pills that you would take for a pill-induced abortion. They said that there's this is not in line with Oklahoma values, which obviously we are anti-abortion state in terms of our legal system with that now. But is that really up to Todd Russ? Especially when the Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court basically handed the control of abortion back to states, and some states have kept it or expanded it. And so how do you tell a national firm, hey, stop distributing this pill because our state doesn't like it or our leaders don't like it, when it's perfectly legal and, in other states to do that? So how do you get back to kind of the, there was the kind of Chamber of Commerce Republicans that were around for so long and are still out there that say, look, why are we micromanaging these affairs of these companies?
Right.
Why are we having a patchwork policy? Why don't we have one policy? We have that for trade among states. And so, why would it be any different in terms of shareholder resolutions? Now, these are all kind of essentially non-binding things. They ask companies to do reports and come back to the shareholder with the resolution sponsor. Right. And so, they're not going to kind of pull out of a market just because a shareholder resolution said so.
Right.
But I mean, that's definitely one of the things that you would use to argue that point. It was like, well, we have to have these investments, if we're benefiting from them, they have to be in line with what they're kind of nebulously calling Oklahoma values,
right.
Which is one of the reasons that they're using to kind of go after these corporations.
Right.
They're not in line with Oklahoma values. And in fact, one of the board members, there's a vacancy on that 5-person TSET board of investors. The Speaker of the House has not made his appointment to that, but the other ones are appointees for the governor. And of course, Todd Russ is a chairman, and then the Senate Pro Tem and the state auditor. They make up, appointees of those people make up this board. One of the board members actually pushed back last week at the meeting and said, look, one of these resolutions targets Boeing for its DEI corporate policies. He's like, look, Boeing has been in Oklahoma and definitely at Tinker for decades, 50, 60, 70 years, going back to post-World War II. It's been a valuable corporate partner for a lot of places in Oklahoma, a prime federal contractor, employs a ton of people in Oklahoma.
Right.
Why are we bashing them over the head with a shareholder resolution?
Right.
Why don't we just go talk to them and ask them to do some stuff rather than actually putting it in a public shareholder resolution that's on a proxy that people would be voting on? And so he said, look, I don't know what the Oklahoma values that you're talking about would mean, which they never really discussed in depth what they were. And also, why are we going after Boeing when they've been, a fairly involved corporate actor here in Oklahoma for decades?
Right.
We can probably just sit down and talk to them. They're pretty reasonable people, he said. So.
Right. Well, and I mean, you run the risk of like a more substantial negative blowback, right? Where I don't think it's going to happen, but Boeing could be like, "How dare you?
Well, right.
We're going to close our factories in Oklahoma." And now the state is injured, like in a real way.
Yeah, and we've seen it like even last year when the 5 resolutions that came up. One of them was targeting Google, which their parent company is Alphabet. Google just last month announced an $8 billion investment expansion in the state. They have a ton of employees, and obviously a lot of people use their products in Oklahoma. Last year's also targeted Amazon, and they're doing another one for Amazon this year on a different subject. But Amazon is now, I think after Walmart, the largest private employer in Oklahoma. They've got something like 28,000 people working in Oklahoma for either a distribution center, a fulfillment center, or out driving the trucks.
Sure.
And so, these are not small employers, and they're fairly, active in Oklahoma's economy.
Yeah.
And so what message does that send to those companies? I mean, none of them are, to be honest, take it personally.
Right.
They kind of just see it as part of what their function is they're a public company and they can choose to go private and not have shareholders.
Right.
But they do, and they find that beneficial for access to capital and markets and all that kind of stuff. So, this is kind of an interesting kind of thing that the treasurer is doing and getting a lot of advice from different groups that are maybe not necessarily aligned with local economies in Oklahoma.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, so I did some Googling. Speaking of Google, I use it every day. So I looked up McKesson in particular. So there's about 125 million shares of McKesson outstanding. So let's say TSET owns, I don't know, 5 million.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
shares.
Mhm.
Let's say we own 5 million, or that fund owns 5 million shares. So they would be able to, that's still less than 1% of the total amount. They could put this up for a vote or whatever. But like you said, some other state that's maybe, California values or whatever,
Right.
Oregon or some blue state could like put forth a measure to like go further with like
Right. Any
DEI
policy.
stuff,
Right.
right? And then you've got competing votes. And so I think to me, at best, it seems like performative on the part of the treasurer or the whatever, because he like knows it's not going to do anything. And he's trying to like signal to potential donors for his campaign that like, yeah, I'm with you. Like we should do that. And at worst, then it's like the increased, what I've been calling the partisanization of everything in life, right? Like issues that historically were not partisan issues now are, right? Like the color, I'm sure like the type of shoes you wear or whatever, like all this stuff is becoming signals that this is your political party affiliation. And that if we suddenly begin, not suddenly, but if we slowly begin to partisanize corporate policy in a way, and we already have, right, with the anti-ESG and DEI and all the alphabet soup stuff. But if that starts to become where you end up having companies that are run as Republican valued companies or Democratic value, and some do, right? Like, I don't know a lot of gun manufacturers that also have like liberal DEI policies or whatever. But if we start seeing that for giant, multinational conglomerates like Amazon or Nabisco or whatever, then that world looks, I think, a lot different than our world does today, and not in a good way.
Right, and especially when the whole idea of setting up a corporation with shareholders is to make a return on investment. And this seems like it's getting a little far afield of what that return means to people. And yeah, you're right in terms of, now we have to pick a team. Now we have to get behind a team. And it's just that constant, like, are you a red state or a blue state? I mean, there's no such really thing. There's people of all kinds in most states,
Right.
And, politically you can say you are if you've voted Republican or whatever, and you're a red state. And Oklahoma is. I mean, we can say that, but there's still a chunk of the electorate who is not a Republican and did vote for a Democrat. So, but yeah, it goes back to, and I think partly why the treasurer is kind of using this is because he's been stopped by the courts in our energy discrimination law, which does clamp down on financial firms for ESG so-called policies. And so the legislature has agreed and said that is an issue that we want to get behind. We passed the Oklahoma Energy Discrimination Elimination Act a couple years ago. It got challenged in court. It is on a permanent stay at the district court level as it's being appealed at the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But effectively, all enforcement of that act is stopped, and even the Treasurer's Office himself, under Todd Russ, took exemptions to that for its own banking processes. I mean, they had Bank of America does payment processes for P cards, for purchase cards. The treasurer took an exemption for that because the treasurer put Bank of America on his own blacklist.
Right.
And so you kind of get to the point where how do you get off this so-called blacklist when there's no way to get off of it other than Todd Russ's idea if you've done what they asked you to. And how would you there's a real possibility someone else could get on there, for another action they don't like. So, and who's to say the next treasurer, if they're agreeing with Todd Russ or not, or unlikely to be a Democrat, but if they are, goes a whole other way that they don't like and gets in the TSET's board and said, I want to do all this stuff and ask all these shareholders all these questions that people are like, why are you doing this?
Right.
Well, the mold has kind of been cast, and so we're seeing that now.
That's funny. I will end, though, as I'm thinking about this, about thinking about our state constitution, right? And there was a lot of anti-corporation talk. Like the corporations meant a little something different back then, but there was a lot of recognition that we need to keep corporations in check. It's just funny how we choose which ones to do it with and how now.
No, we have a very populist-based constitution, which, as you know, there's a lot of elected positions that are open.
Yeah.
They think that they should do that. But at the same time, you can't ignore the fact that even after statehood, I think the first bill that the legislature passed was a discriminatory thing against black people.
Right.
So, they had a very populist constitution, but still had racist policies they put into right away when it became a state.
Right. Yeah. We have America and Oklahoma, right? We have a rich, interesting, flawed history that I think we're all still reckoning with. Well, Paul Monies, reporter at Oklahoma Watch, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me, yeah.
I hope you come back again. I'm sorry it's taken so long to have you on.
No, it's fine. These are great conversations to have, so I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
Thanks. Listeners, thank you for being here as well. We hope that you will come back next week as well. Tell your friends. We've got some great additional guests. As I think I said last week, we're going to be shifting a little bit away from the day-to-day TikTok of what's happening at the state capitol. We'll still talk about that some, but I'm going to use Let's Pod This as a platform for some deeper conversations about some of these topics like this, like campaign finance, like TSET, and, you heard the whole conversation. I'm not going to summarize it for you, but we hope that's useful. If you have thoughts, ideas, or subjects you want to hear covered, send us an email, podcast@letsfixthis.org. Remember, decisions are made by those who show up. We'll see you next week.